All right, so we have a special guest tonight or today. We have Cam Josse joining us. So for those that are not familiar with you or where you are along your strength journey, go ahead and introduce yourself to those that may not know who you are.
Yeah, thanks, Coach. So my journey started in the private sector, really. And at this point in my career, I'm working in the college setting, but I spent 7, almost 8 years in the private sector working at DeFranco's training systems in New Jersey. And we also had a brief stint in Austin, Texas before then going back to New Jersey.
Were
So
you with them?
yeah. So basically,
Oh shit.
when I graduated college, that was in 2013, and I went to go work for Joe DeFranco at DeFranco's training systems. And it was a place where I had been training there since I was in high school. So I was really familiar with his system, really familiar with his program. And I had been going back and forth when I was in college, and I was working out there, and I was shadowing Joe and learning from the other trainers there, like Mike Udango and some of these other guys that
I
were
was
there.
gonna ask. All right, I was gonna ask, was he there at the time?
Oh yeah. Mike was another guy that I shadowed while I was there. And so between
Did you guys
Joe
go to the same school? Because he was at Delaware for a little bit, right?
Yeah, no, I went to University of Rhode Island.
Okay,
So
because I didn't know if you guys ever crossed paths at all, seen each other there. Or
not
just
in
only at
school. I think
DeFranco's?
Mike's probably about 6 years older than me or so.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I was about to
Yeah.
say when you graduated 2013, that made me feel old because I finished my master's before then. So
Yeah, so Mike's a little bit older than me, but so Mike was already working at DeFranco's when I was sort of shadowing those guys. So when I would come home, in the summers and things when I was in college, and I was studying kinesiology and exercise science, and so we were able to all connect where I was able to follow Joe for his sessions, and I would see what Mike was doing for his sessions. There were some other trainers there at the time, Pat Carosa, Jeff Carr. And so it really allowed me to go right head first into what the private sector was all about, and just learning a lot about programming, books to read, all of that stuff at that time. And so what I then did was I took an internship in college in 2013 in the spring. I went to University of South Carolina, and that was in a college setting with the football team. Had a little bit of work with the track and field team at the time, and helped out with some other teams like soccer. And they had like ROTC came in the morning, things like that. And then I was trying to decide between, should I go be a GA and kind of work my way up the college route, or should I try and do the private sector because I was more familiar with that? And then got on the phone with Joe DeFranco, and he had an opening for more of an entry level position there. And so that's when I started working with Joe, because he asked me if I wanted to take that position. I said, absolutely. And so after I graduated in 2013, I started working with Joe, and really I just went on this whole journey with DeFranco's. And so I want to say it was 2014. I actually had taken a side job coaching high school football at my alma mater at Indian Hills High School in Oakland, New Jersey. Shout out to them. And then it was cool because I was able to be a little bit on the tactical and technical side too, because I was.
what position did you coach for? Like, were you?
I coached the running backs and then the safeties. And then I also called the defense. And it was
Holy
crazy
shit.
because I was, 23 years old and just trying to
Having a
figure it out,
blast.
Right. So it was actually the most fun I had really up to that point. And really for the rest of the private sector career I had, I looked back on that high school setting, and that's what made me want to go back into the team setting really. But after in 2014, I talked with Joe, and he said he was thinking about moving the business down to Austin, Texas to try and start something down there with DeFranco's. And so he asked me if I wanted to go down there and run that. And so I did. And I went down there for 2 years. And Texas is really hard to tap into from a private sector standpoint, because every single school seems to have their own high school strength coach. They
Really, Texas? You sure?
right. Or they contract people to come to the school and do all that. So I was trying to tap into that a little bit, but it was like every school in the surrounding area in Austin, for the most part, that, like the Westlake High School, Lake Travis, schools like that, they seem to either have a strength coach or have somebody coming in. And so it was tough to do. And so I called Joe and I said, hey, Texas is pretty hard to tap into from a market standpoint. Maybe I just come back to New Jersey. And went back to New Jersey. I want to say it was 2016, and then spent another 4 years there. So really from 2013 to 2020, I was with Joe, and I'm really grateful for that whole experience, because that allowed me to get so much hands-on experience in terms of coaching and programming and working with athletes from all different levels, all different sports. I mean, everything from American football in high school to the NFL to I took on a client who was a Danish handball player, a guy from Denmark who was a professional handball player. It just every sport you can think of, really, that would be a team sport or something where they were trying to work with, trainers in the private sector. So it was pretty cool. It was a great experience, and I'm grateful for it. Just the broad spectrum of clients I was able to take on. And so but in 2020, I really got the itch to return back to a team setting. I thought back on that experience when I was coaching high school, and I was like, you know what, that was just so much fun being able to take a team throughout the whole year and then watch them perform in the season. And so I was like, I want to go back into college football. I had played college football, I'd been around it, and I just missed that environment. And so I took a position at University of North Carolina, Charlotte, I want to say January of 2020. And I was with Chris Laskowski down there. He's still there. Awesome guy. I love Chris. And he's got phenomenal energy, phenomenal devotion to his athletes and coaching. And he just does a really good job. And I was there for about a month and a half before I got a call from Aaron Wellman, who, when I had met him, was the head strength coach of the New York Giants. And I had gotten to know Aaron over probably 2 or 3 years or so. I actually met him at Mike's gym, at Guadango's gym. There was a seminar there that James Smith was putting on, and Aaron was there. And that's when I first met him. And then we stayed in touch, and he would come to DeFranco's. Sometimes I would go to the Giants and see him, and we stayed in touch here and there, texted, called each other. And he called me and said he was leaving the Giants to go to Indiana University, and offered me a position to go with him there. And so after having only been at Charlotte for about 2 months, I decided it was best for me and my career and my family to take the position at Indiana. And so came to Indiana in, I want to say, March of 2020. And that was right in the middle of, obviously, all the crazy COVID stuff. And so got here, took on this role, didn't even get to see the athletes until probably June, and that was when we thought we were going to have a season, and the season kind of got canceled in the Big Ten. And it was just a wild year. But basically, I've been in Indiana since then, in 2020. And it's been an awesome experience. Working with Aaron Wellman was something I always wanted to do. And I'm learning so much from him, and just the athletes I'm surrounded by, the coaches, the other strength coaches. It's been an awesome experience. And I'm really grateful to be where I am at this point.
We actually had Pete Remis on the show probably 2-3 months back, who worked with you for a little bit before he headed back down.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, Pete was another great, because Pete, in that same area.
Pete's the best.
Oh, Pete's a great dude. Right?
Were you guys at Iowa together at all?
We were. He was an intern, part of the intern class, I want to say, of 16 maybe. And I mean, he was head and shoulders the best intern. We're like, we got to hire this kid back. Like, he was a rock star.
Pete, it's so hard to find anybody that will work harder than him. And he's like an encyclopedia or like an almanac. Hey, have you heard about this training method or this coach? Or, oh yeah. Like, he knows all about everybody. He's an under the radar guy, but phenomenal coach, knows everything seemingly. And he's all around just one of the best workers and coaches I've ever been around. And
he seems like really salt of the earth kind of guy.
Oh yeah, 100%. And so I'm really happy for him and what he's doing at Texas A&M now too.
What would you say to any of our listeners out there and members that, like, what is the private sector side missing that causes people to do exactly what you said, to have that itch after 7 years at a place of DeFranco's, where you did get a ton of autonomy, it seems like, from whatever we saw on social media. Seeing people like you and Wadango growing within the DeFranco branch. But even that, you said you had that itch. What is it, in your opinion, and what would be the piece of advice you would give to anybody that is considering it while in the private sector right now?
Well, for me, and I can only speak about my experience.
Yeah, speak on your experience, and then in vague generalities.
For me, what was awesome about it at first was exactly what you just said. It was the autonomy. Joe basically threw me to the wolves, where he's like, you have your clients, you've been around me, figure it out. So it was sink or swim, or, and if I messed up with a client, which 100% I did early in my career, if you mess up in terms of not getting the results you want, or, they pull a hamstring or something like that happens in the training, you have to realize what you did and how to fix it, or that dude's not going to come back and see you because he's paying for your training. So it's really sink or swim from that standpoint. So I think in terms of being thrown into the fire, and having to figure it out on the fly. I'm super grateful for that. And at the same time, Joe gave me full autonomy where he's like, you're writing the program, you're doing it. He wasn't micromanaging at all. And he just had a ton of faith in the guys that were working for him that they were going to do what they felt was right. And, it was something where we all learned under him, and he just trusted, take the education that I've given you and now make it uniquely your own and do what you want to do with it. And so I think that's where I was able to really blossom and grow as a coach was exactly that. Just being put in that situation. But for me, what I felt like I was missing was, for me, the most rewarding part of the job is watching the athlete compete in their respective arena. And so I'm a firm believer in that the greatest test of your program is how they end up performing, and so what did I make any kind of a difference, or was it just, I gave you something run of the mill, you were fit enough to go in there, and then, you were able to perform somewhat. I wanted to feel as though I had a hand in really helping that person. And so for me, the most rewarding part was watching them perform and compete. And so what was tough for me in the private sector was they would come to me during the off-season periods of whatever sport they played, and then they would leave for the competitive period. And unless they were a pro athlete that I could watch on TV, I couldn't see any of their games or any of their competitions, or just depending on what the sport was, their matches, their fights, if it was a UFC fighter or whatever. I wasn't able to see all of that stuff. And so for me, I would have to rely on calling that client, hey, how'd it go? How was the game? Or, how was the match? How was the fight? And so what I loved about coaching high school was I got to go to every game and be a part of it and watch it all come to life. And if I wasn't seeing what I wanted to see, I was making notes about, okay, we need to work on this next off season, or we need to figure this part out. And so for me, that was the most rewarding part. And so I think that's what I was craving after 7 years in the private sector, was just, I'm training all these football players in the off season and they leave. And like the most dead period at any point in DeFranco's, because football was such a big sport at DeFranco's, was football season, where you could ask Wodango or any of these other guys that were there. It was just a dead zone during football season. And that's when you're left being like, man, it'd be great to just be able to watch these dudes every week, and you can't go see every athlete either. And so that's what I missed about it, was just, I want to take one team or one population of people, and I want to be with them all year round and just see what they go through, and their training, their psychological ebbs and flows, the way they're picking up the game, their skill development, all of that stuff. That to me was what I was craving, that I didn't have in the private sector, because in the private sector, it's just training. And usually they're in a pretty good mood because they're coming there to pay for their training.
Probably at the time that they want to.
Yeah. And so you have to motivate to a degree, but it's just different than being in college, where there are scheduled workouts that they don't always feel like being there. And so how do I now get another version of motivating, because this person's not paying to be here, they're required to be here because of their duties to the university and the football team or whatever it might be. And so the other thing too is I just wanted to solve bigger problems. It was, all this stuff was within my control in the private sector, but at the same time, I wasn't really learning how to commingle with a sports medicine staff, a nutrition staff, a sports science staff, a coaching staff. All of that stuff just wasn't there. There was none of that. The biggest commingling I had was with parents of kids, and the rest of it was just, I get the kid, I do whatever I want, and then they go home and then they come back tomorrow. So
I mean, even the closest that you might have was if you guys had any like massage therapists on staff and tried that way, or what?
Yeah, which we didn't really have at DeFranco.
Okay.
So that's why like Mike's taking it upon himself now to get his degree in acupuncture. And so you just start realizing, if I want to learn more about these things, I probably just have to do it myself in the private sector, where in this setting, whether it's college or a pro setting, you have multiple teams of people, and if it's a nice organic setting, you can learn from those people too. And so that to me is what I love about where I am now, is that there's multiple teams of people that have their own different emphases of knowledge but I can go talk to those people and learn their point of view on certain things. And that can help me grow further than I felt like I was able to grow in the private sector, where ultimately you're, for the most part, a salesman and a personal trainer, and so you are a coach, you are working with athletes, but it's much more a personal training type of model, like a sales model type of setup, which is, it's great to learn about business. But in terms of what fulfills me is the organic chemistry with an athlete, with a player, and with all of the hands on deck that deal with that player. And so that's what I was craving. And that's ultimately why I decided to come back to more of a team setting and leave the private sector.
So I didn't know, and I'm guessing that maybe our listeners didn't know too. When you went to, I didn't know that you went to Charlotte prior to Indiana. I thought you just left DeFranco's and went right there. So my question is, were you football only? Were you all sports?
At Charlotte?
Yeah.
Charlotte was football only.
Oh, okay, too. Because that
Yeah.
the reason that I asked that was you had said that you wanted to dive in a full population with just one team. So was that that was kind of the stipulation for you from leaving DeFranco's was, look, I don't want to be a director of all these sports. I want to just fully dive in and commit with one team.
Right. Yeah. And so football is really my passion because
Yep.
it's the sport I played. It's the sport I studied the most. And it was primarily the biggest population we had at DeFranco's. And so for me, I just felt like I want to go work for a football team. And so that's why I'll be forever grateful to Chris Laskowski for giving me that opportunity. And I mean, I would have never known that Aaron Wellman would have left the New York Giants to come to Indiana University. So, you know, I loved it there at Charlotte with Chris and Will Healy, the head coach. Like, it's just an awesome environment. It's a great place. The kids were awesome. You know, I was all in. And then ultimately I just decided that the level of experience I would get with Aaron Wellman in terms of he and I had already known each other and we had hashed a lot of things out, and I knew exactly what sort of program he was going to put in and implement. And so for me, I had already been bought into Aaron Wellman. And so when he called me, it was just, it was too big of an opportunity for me to pass up. And so ultimately that's why I decided to come here.
For any of the people that are, private sector as well right now, and they're doing exactly what you said, working with all kinds of different types of athletes. And, the knock, we just recently hired one of our former interns who was working in the private sector for a while. And one of the things that she knew that she had to answer was people being like, oh, well, you haven't worked in team settings before.
Yeah.
And she was like, well, yeah, but I've also worked with all these different types of athletes, and I've had to sell or talk to parents, and I've had to work in that kind of a high performance environment. What would be your piece of advice? Again, I know you can only speak on your behalf, but what were you preparing yourself to be able to say to people on your interviews about the fact that, hey, look, I know I haven't been in team setting for a while, but I still worked with this population and I know what I got to do. Like, how would you sell that information to them?
It's exactly what you just said. I mean, that happened to me. I ultimately, what I did when I decided I wanted to go to the team setting was I sent my resume to every FBS school in the country.
Oh, shit.
And then I was like, let's just see what happens, and if I didn't get any bites at that point, my plan was to go every FCS school in the country and just keep working my way down, Division II, Division III, whatever. Because to me, it didn't matter about the level at which I went to. It was, I just want to get into a situation where, one, obviously I wanted to be able to have some sense of affordability in terms of being able to live. But at the same time, it was, for me, it was really just about, can I get into a team setting? So if it was a high school, I would have done it, that, something that made sense from that standpoint.
Yep.
So, but that's what I did. And I got a lot of emails back from people that were saying, hey, we love your content and all of that stuff. We're just worried because you're a private sector guy, and so, and I appreciated their honesty, and so, and that was a big thing with Chris Laskowski, who seemed to bite the most of anybody. At least he was the first one that was really like, you know what, I want to interview you and give you a shot. But on the interview and during that whole period, it was exactly that. It was like, you haven't been in this setting. How can I know you're the right hire? And so I had to do exactly what you said. I had to try and point out the fact. I had to acknowledge my limitations. I feel like that was important first, to say, you're right. I haven't worked in the setting. But at least in my experience, I was like, I have worked in the team setting in terms of working in a high school setting, communicating with those athletes, being a football coach and a strength coach to kids who are all over the place in terms of their attention span and trying to get them to figure out what to do. And at the same time, I've worked with kids of all ages from really middle school to high school to college to professional. So I just had this large bandwidth of experience in terms of communicating with different athletes from different sports. And basically, sometimes it's the same exercise. You got to give it 10 different ways because you're working with 10 different people who just understand things totally differently from each other. Like football players to me are funny because a lot of them, for the most part, if you go by position group, it's like the same dude with a different face. Like most of the time, offensive linemen, you figure out how to talk to offensive linemen.
Yeah, they're all
backs and receivers. You learn how to talk to those guys, and things like that. And so, but then within that, the different ages. So when you go to college, it's like, can I communicate to a 17, 18-year-old as well as a 23 up to maybe 24-year-old nowadays? Just kids are in college for 7-8 years, it seems like.
I had a 25-year-old kid that was transferred.
Yeah, they're
He's
spending
from Europe. Like,
yeah, or just with all the COVID
years,
the red shit year. It's like they got freaking 10 years in college now. But so I had to talk about that, and I had to say, I've worked with athletes in the pros as well. Like even the Undertaker, who I worked with, he was in his 50s when I worked with him and still trying to wrestle. And so at a high level, and so sure, it's wrestling entertainment, but this dude still got to jump off ropes and do all kinds of stuff. And he'd been under the knife more times than I can count, the amount of surgeries this guy had. And so I tried to talk about those experiences of, hey, I've had to figure it out with all these people in a 1,000 square foot weight room with one rack and a set of dumbbells, just basically talk about all the different ways that I've had to figure it out. And so just trying to hope and pray that would have been enough to have somebody take a chance on me and say, you know what, at least we're getting a good coach, and then we can hope that he's able to adapt to this setting. And so I think what really helps me in this regard was the fact that I played football, and just having been in a college football setting as a player, how that can prepare you for something like this. And so I think whether it's football or the Olympic side, if you've participated in collegiate sport, it certainly helps you with a leg up. I'm not saying you have to in order to work in the field, but I do believe it helps you from an empathetic standpoint, connect with athletes and coaches and all of that stuff. So, I just think ultimately you just have to have a lot of self-confidence, and you got to know it's exactly what you want. Because I think one of the things, admittedly, I struggled with was taking that step back and realizing, okay, I don't have as much control as I had before. It was easy to tell myself that before going into it. But then when I got into it and feeling that, it's humbling. It's like, okay, like I'm not the guy anymore. I'm just a guy who works for these guys, the players. So doesn't mean you can't have impact and influence and all that stuff. It just means you have to realize how you fit into the bigger picture, which is exactly what I was looking for. So
that's a great piece of advice. I think I think you hit the nail on the head.
It's really about just how bad do you want to do it? And then having faith in yourself and belief that there's going to be some friction. It's going to be an adjustment. It's going to be totally different. There's going to be some things that you could have never foreseen, no matter how many college football coaches you talk to or college strength coaches you talk to. There's just going to be stuff that comes up. And so just being willing to do that, the hours that go into it. I used to make my own schedule at DeFranco's, and now I'm waking up at 4 or 5 a.m. every day. And it's just.
Isn't that because I've heard Wellman is like crazy and wakes up at like 3:30, but that was back when he was doing his PhD. Is he still doing that? Or
no, he's still doing that. Yeah, he's built his habits that he has for the last 25, 26 years in the industry. And but yeah, I mean, we're a morning team too, so that also influences the fact that we have to get up early and be here for the guys. And a lot of times we're rolling with something by 6 a.m. And so but that was an adjustment, because at DeFranco's I usually at the earliest I would have a client maybe at 7:30 a.m., and I'd go all the way throughout the rest of the day, but it was on and off. It wasn't like straight through. And so it's just, some of these things they're adjustments just depending on where you come from and what you're doing. But for me, it's exactly what I wanted. And it's every day I'm reminded of that I'm exactly where I want to be. So really,
that's awesome. when you brought up the Undertaker thing, and I'm sure that helped because you were able to say like, hey, this is I've worked with some really successful people, and I wrote down success leaves clues. What were some other, you know, best piece of advices that you gave during the interview, or things that you learned or gleaned from these highly successful people that you worked with? And again, you don't need to name names, but like, you know, some of the habits or some of the things that you saw somebody, like you said, who's 50 years old, had a ton of surgeries, like the work ethic and the drive that you saw them, you know, if it's, hey, so and so was a high achiever because he understood his limitations, knew that he had to show up early, take care of his body. Like, what were some of the success that leaves clues that you saw over your time, that you would give, or that you did give, you know, to people hiring you, and then any of our listeners here?
Yeah, I mean, I tell our players here, and Wellman can say the same thing, probably even more so than me, having been in a professional football setting. But any of the pro athletes, whether they were football players or WWE wrestlers or whatever, anybody who had been doing it at that level for more than 5 years, really, the guys who really last and stay around and don't fizzle out immediately, they have a lot of the same habits. They are very disciplined in what they do. Like, they're very committed to their craft, and they're just about willing to do anything they can to continue their craft. They're very ritualistic, just the habits that they form, you know, like, so a lot of the NFL guys, when they would come in, I could give them sort of a pre-warm-up routine, pre-activation routine, but they also had their own. You know, they would come in with their bag full of the supplements that they take, you know, the routines that they do, the stuff that they had picked up on that's worked for them to allow them to get to where they are. And so for me, what I told the people that were interviewing me or talking to me about it, what I've learned more lessons from the pros that I've worked with than any book or coach could teach me, because from them, I'm getting it right from the horse's mouth. You know, like they're in it, they're doing it. And so I talked to guys that might be, you know, maybe this guy's mid-30s, still playing defensive back in the NFL. How are you doing that? Like, how are you able to just run around, keep up with these rookie receivers? You know, how are you doing it? And so you start interviewing them and talking to them, and you realize what a lot of these guys do is simplistic in nature, but it's very ritualistic. Like, it's just, I have my habits, I have my routines. And a lot of them start to realize as their career moves on, they have to prioritize certain things. Like, yeah, I'm not gonna go out. I'm not gonna eat certain things. I'm gonna change my diet. I'm gonna sleep more. You know, it's very interesting seeing some of the pro football guys when they were sort of in their mid-20s leading into their 30s, and how from like 25 to 30 years old, how much they would change in those 5 years in terms of just, I need to fizzle out some of this stuff that's taking away from my performance and start focusing more on these things that add to my performance. And so these are things that we talk about with our guys here, because at this level, it's Big Ten football. So we have a lot of guys in theory that could become pro athletes. And so you have to talk with them about these things, and you have to have them realize, you know, these are some of the habits you need to form. These are some of the disciplines you need to enlist upon yourself. And because success does leave clues, and a lot of them are very similar, whether it is the Undertaker or it's an NFL player or whoever they might be, a hockey player, NHL player. The biggest thing is that they're just not afraid to put the work in. They're not afraid to do what they need to do in order to succeed in what they're doing. And so our guys that struggle to have certain balance in their life, I'm not saying every pro athlete is balanced by any means, but typically what they do is they find ways to continue getting to the field and performing in their respective arena. And so you learn a lot of lessons from those guys. And so another thing that, you know, would come up in some of these interviews with me coming out of the private sector was, what have you done to help these young kids succeed, whether they're in high school? And so you start having to tell them stories about, you know, I had the dude who was 16 years old, 140 pounds, and trying to play varsity football as a wide receiver on his high school team. And the coach is saying he's too small. And over the next 2 years, I watched him put on 40 pounds. Now he's 180 pounds and he's playing receiver and getting looks from colleges and stuff like that. You know, so you start having to prove some of these ways in which you've helped develop guys as well. Because a lot of times when you have pro athletes, a lot of times they're developed. I mean, they're already at the pro level. So Your job is to make sure they feel great enough to go out and continue playing. And it's a give and take sort of relationship with those guys where a lot of times they're sort of telling you how they want to be trained. Whereas if you have that young kid, he's basically talking about how he knows nothing. I don't know what to eat. I don't know how to train. Like, you have to tell me everything. And so it's very interesting to have the experience from both sides on such a drastic scale like that. And so that's another thing I'm grateful to have experienced being in the private sector.
You mentioned the fact that both you and Aaron had, the NFL ties. That had to at least be one less thing that you had to overly sell to them when you're like, hey, I'm trying to give you advice on, the guys that may be done and they've graduated and they're moving on, trying out for their pro day or combine. Like, that had to be, like, oh man, like, I don't have to sell this right now. Like you can almost go on autopilot and now it should be easier for them to listen to you guys, right?
Yeah. You're talking about when we came to Indiana?
Yeah, when you came to Indiana, because now you're like, hey guys, like, okay, I can, boom, now you're back in your wheelhouse, for lack of a better term.
Right. Yeah. And so, like, and Wellman says the same thing. Like, when you're in the NFL, you really only have the guys in season. And so a lot of times it's
a heck of a long season, right? I mean,
yeah. And so you can still develop to a certain degree, but a lot of it is almost like you're a NASCAR pit crew, just keeping that car on the road. It's just, how do I tweak this and tweak that and make sure he can get back out there, which I think there's a huge benefit to that too, like managing a team in season. And that was a whole thing I never had in the private sector, because I only had him in the off season. That's where I feel like my relationship with Aaron really was beneficial to me, was I was able to ask him about what he's doing in season and how I didn't have that hands-on experience, where it was interesting because when he was in the NFL, he didn't really see him in the off season, where that's when I had all the guys. So it was just, you get them in the off season, you can do a lot more creative stuff and develop them in different ways. But it's one of those things where, again, that's where I wanted both experiences firsthand. I wanted to be able to see that. And so now I'm able to do that. And managing a team in season is such a unique art, and being able to just find a way to keep that dude on the field, work around all the bumps and bruises that they're inevitably going to accrue during the season. I mean, it's a collision-based sport. I mean, it's just, anybody who's saying they don't have any injuries on their team is absolutely full of it. I mean,
right? Oh my God,
like,
feel the same way.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, because there's going to be something, they're going to get banged up in some way, shape, or form. Might not be season ending, but there's something that's going to happen. You got to work around and find a way to get the stresses imposed upon that athlete that you want, and get the adaptations you're looking for, but ensure at the same time they can keep playing the game. And so I love that aspect of it. But yeah, you're exactly right, where he and I having those experiences of seeing it at the highest level and now coming back to this sort of middle zone between high school and pro, just being in this college setting, it's huge, because, it's like, you're not in high school anymore. You got to start to grow up. But in order to reach that level, here are the things you need to do. And so, and they buy into that. The kids really, they love that. They sit and talk with Wellman all the time about his experience with the Giants. And, it's so beneficial to these kids to ask those questions, I think.
That's awesome. And, switching gears a little bit to be able to talk about, those qualities that you were able to develop in the off season. A lot of people know you probably for, one of two things. Either it's, the books with Fergus and the process, or, how good and how proficient you are with sprint stuff. I mean, you're on the fundamentals program talking about sprint work. You've spoke on, multiple different podcasts or different outlets. How did you get so good at it? Like, what was the aha moment? How did you get so good with the kinograms? Like, again, just kind of dive into that and how you're able to help so many different team sport coaches like you have.
I think with the speed stuff, it was a combination of what we were doing with Joe at the time, which was a lot of horizontal loading. Joe was really big. When I was in high school, he was really big on pulling sleds, pushing sleds, resisted sprinting, a lot of that horizontal dominant resistance type of work, and feeling how that was helping me as an athlete.
Now, was that due to the restriction of his facility?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. I mean,
okay.
because the facility that in which I trained with him was, it was a weight room, and then he had a tread sled device, which is basically like a self-propelled treadmill that, it's flat, and you have like a little belt around yourself, and you have to run on it. And you can change the resistances on it. So that was basically like our resisted sprinting on that device. And then in the back was just a parking lot. And we used to just drag sleds forward, backwards, sideways. We'd push prowlers. He was experimenting with the prowlers on us at the time. They were kind of a new thing that was coming out at the time. And I think he was trying to figure out how can we get positive benefits from this without dudes throwing up everywhere. Because every time he would try something with the prowler, we'd all just end up puking everywhere.
The prowler flu that they put on that little label.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can get so lactic so fast with that thing. But I just remember feeling how much better my acceleration and all that stuff felt as a high school kid when we were doing all of that. But then when I would come back and I would intern, quote unquote, there, when I would shadow those guys, that was right around when Mike Wadango had met James Smith and Buddy Morris, and he had done a little internship with them when they were at Pittsburgh. And they had turned him on to a lot of the Charlie Francis stuff and all of that sprint work. And Joe was also familiar with Charlie Francis. He had actually seen him speak and taken notes at his seminars. And so we all just started talking about that stuff. And Mike especially was turning me on to certain things to read by these guys. And that's what started the journey down the path of like, okay, speed is important. We can't just lift weights and drag sleds and do things like that. At some point we need to do something that's fast and explosive. And that's important for us to do. And when I started getting more into training my own athletes, I realized that was a niche that hadn't yet fully taken off. There were guys that were doing it, but a lot of places were still squat, clean, bench, and do your 110s and your gassers and like the classic
real football stuff,
real classic football stuff. And I just started searching more into it. And so that just led me down the path of, reading everything by Charlie Francis, all the stuff from James Smith on sprint training and all of that. That then led me into learning about Dan Paff, Bush Exonator, Stu McMillan, all these guys. And then I was able to get in touch with Stu McMillan and Altus and all of those guys. And that's when it really took off, was when I could start talking to these guys firsthand, learn from them. I was able to meet guys like Chris Corfus when I was in Austin. I met Peter Holmers from 1080 Motion down there, and he knew all these other guys. And eventually that just led me into talking with JB Marin and Ken Clark and all of these guys. And I just started studying all of it because it started really taking off at the same time that I was really into it. And so I think it was just sort of right place, right time, a lot of it, but it was also my commitment to learning about it. And there's a lot that I was diving into at the time, and even stuff I was writing about that now I realize I didn't fully understand at the time. And, I've learned so much more about it since I've gotten more into it, because when you first read it, you think, okay, if I just have my athletes sprint, like they're going to be off the charts fast, it's going to be great. Right. And then you start doing that with athletes and you're like, it doesn't quite work that way either. So there's this whole complexity to balancing all of that stuff. And so, I just think it was right around the time it was starting to take off in the industry in general, but at the same time, I was super into it, and that allowed me to be just, I don't know what the word would be, but I just decided I'm going to reach out to these people. Worst case is they don't email me back, or they don't text me back, or whatever. They don't call me back. So I'm just going to reach out to all these guys and see if they respond. And almost all of them responded, and it was great. And so you build a correspondence with these coaches, and it just helped me immensely. And that then led me to talking to Fergus and guys like that. And it was just, it just took off. The more I think about how organic it really was, whereas like, I just want to find out more about this. Who knows about this? Let me contact that person. And it really was as simple as that.
One of the things that, I kind of alluded to when you were talking about the facility is one of the things I remember Mike Boyle talked about, 18 or 19, but his thing was always, he has a shorter facility. So he doesn't have the ability for athletes to do as long of flies. He's talking about like, they might do a 5-yard build, 10-yard fly, 10-yard build, 10-yard fly, but then they have to slow down before the wall. And then he also was talking about how, in a 40, your slowest 10 is the first 10. So that has the greatest amount of hypothetical ability to be decreased. So that's where all the time needs to be spent to work on acceleration, work on acceleration. How do you, again, I know only Sith Lords work in extremes, but how do you handle that thought with the other notion of the people you talked about, JB Morin, Ken Clark, of, max velocity shifts the whole curve and it's good for acceleration? How do you take any of that?
I think they're both right, and so I think to assume that if you just improve your 10, something like a 40 will drastically improve. I think there's a lot of limitations to that. I think that there's a certain experience with sprinting upright at maximal speed that has to be felt and coordinated and just experienced in order to adapt to that and become comfortable in that situation. And it's drastically different than the first 10. I think that you could beat the first 10 into the ground, and it does not mean that you're going to be great past the 20-yard mark. I think that's all my opinion based on what I've seen and what I've felt and what I've seen from athletes. And at the same time, I think that the overemphasis on max velocity is harmful to a degree as well, because I think that while there's some truth to that, because it's been shown objectively and measured that you can improve every segment if your max velocity goes up in theory. But I just think that from what I've seen, it's got to be more tailored to what that athlete is being asked to do. And so I like using the example of a running back in football, because people always think the running back has to be really, really fast. And obviously it helps if they are. And everybody always uses the extreme examples like Chris Johnson runs a 4.2, whatever. And so they think it's speed, speed, speed. Well, for me, when I look at a running back, it's not speed, it's rate of acceleration. Because, and I had this conversation with Mike Wadango not too long ago on the phone, which was, think about in football from a statistical standpoint, if that running back gets an 8-yard gain, that's a good play.
Really?
If that dude gets 12 yards, that's a first down and 2 more yards. Like that, a coach would be ecstatic. Oh, we just ran the ball and got 12 yards. Awesome. And yeah, of course, there's going to be times where they break a 50+ yard run, but it's so rare, right? It just doesn't really happen at our level, especially. It'll happen more, if you're a freak high school player, it'll happen all the time. But if you're in the Big Ten and you're playing running back, for you to expect to break runs that would really get you to a true max speed environment, it's going to happen very rarely. It might happen once a game or less, And so to me, it's that rate of acceleration. When I see the hole, how quickly can I go from 0 to 60, right? And so I think that's where we get mixed up with the overemphasis on speed, is that you have these different qualities of speed that exist in each player, and the emphasis and the requirements of each are going to be different based on the position that athlete plays, And so for me to say, I think max speed is important, I'm going to do it with my linemen, it's kind of like, why? You have to ask that question for real. You might have a reason, but if your reason is to help with their game performance, that's ridiculous. It's just never going to happen. You're gonna show me the one clip of Lyle Collins on the Cowboys when he pulled and ran 50 yards downfield. I mean, that almost never happens, ever. So everybody likes to use the outlier play situation of like, here's proof that speed kills at every position. And the D tackle that hawks the dude down 40 yards downfield and makes the play. And okay, yeah, I mean, like, he needs to be able to do that when he needs to do that. But what's going to make him great at his position for 99% of the other times he's out there playing? You have to ask yourself what qualities are important for that player. And so I just think that if you're too extreme in your thoughts about all my skill and big skill players need to be able to have tremendously high max velocities and all of that, it just depends, in my opinion. And what does that guy do well? So that's where I'm at this point in my career, is when I'm studying this player and his speed capabilities, his power capabilities, I'll give you an example how we have a running back on our team who hits a higher max velocity than anybody on the team. And he's a running back. And it's because he was a track and field sprinter. I think he ran sub 10.3 in high school, like very fast. Right. And he's built like a brick wall. So he looks like he's a power guy, but he's actually not, so it's like one of these things where just looks won't tell you either. So, and what's interesting with him is when you test him across all these different tests is you watch him do something like a hex bar deadlift, you could easily do over 500, and then he hits this really high max velocity. But if you have him do something like a loaded jump, he's one of the worst performers. So for some reason, there's a disconnect there in terms of his strength speed or his pure explosive power against heavy resistance.
Yeah. How's his
So
10,
it's like,
right?
you start, what's that?
How's his 10 or
Not great. You know what I mean? Like that's where, and I think it's because of his track and field background in a way. He can produce a lot of force because he's very strong in a vertical direction, interestingly enough, right? Which is what a hex bar is, but not a lot of power in terms of just that pure explosive nature. So his 10 is actually by far the worst part of his whole sprint. But if you can get him past 10 yards, nobody's going to catch him. Like, it's just the way it is. Like, if you can get him past 15, for sure, nobody's going to catch him.
so for a running back like him, right? Like if he's got to stop, move, reaccelerate, like he needs that breakaway play to get away, right?
Exactly right. So he struggles in comparison to other running backs with that. The start,
even though
stop,
he's the
cut.
fastest.
Right. Even though he's by far off the charts in terms of max velocity, the fastest one. And then you have another guy who not even close max velocity wise. I mean, like not even in the same ballpark. But if we did something like a loaded hex bar jump and we said like, hey, you need to be above this takeoff speed. And if you're above it, you keep adding weight and whatever. This dude's got the most weight on the bar and he's moving it the fastest, so it's like he's if speed is consistent, whatever it might be, you got to be above whatever, 1.8 meters per second. He's putting on the most weight and still hitting that speed. Like he's just got power, you know what I mean? And he's strong. And that's the guy that you see, he's not going to just take off for 60, but if you need to pick up a tough first down, he's trucking 3 dudes, running over them and falling forward and getting you those eight plus yards that you need, And so you start thinking about like, okay, each individual guy, what makes them great? How do we capitalize on that? And then put them in situations maybe in the game that allow them to capitalize on that. Because you can get creative with that, Does this guy make sense for kick return? Does this guy make sense for punt return? Right? You might think they're similar, but it's really 2 different skills. Like the punt return is like a quick dude that can make guys miss and give you 10 to 20 yards, maybe return to the house. Awesome. Kick return, you probably want a guy who's purely fast because he can just start taking off running and dudes start stressing because he's just coming at them, like just you start thinking about these different qualities and what they need. And based on all the tests you're doing, how does a certain guy maybe fit that role a little bit better than somebody else? It doesn't mean he can't take off and run 50 plus yards. Doesn't mean he can't truck somebody and run them over. It just means he's probably better suited in these certain situations based on his innate speed capabilities, acceleration, power, strength, all of that stuff. So that's where I'm looking more into that side of it, as opposed to just being too absolutist about let's just improve this or let's just improve that. It's like, well, let's look at all of it and then figure out what this guy's best at, what he excels at, and then we can still continue to bring up the weaknesses too.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. And it's interesting you say that because it reminds me of the game moments that Fergus, I remember he talked about it he was at a G-Dub, George Washington University, when Hammer was still there. He had Fergus talk, and he talked about how like, yeah, cool, you look at your GPS, like what's the game moments and when they would hit those different speeds. Because we had 2 examples this year. I had a running back who was a kick returner. He had gained like 20 pounds over his 3 years here. So like trying to push his max velo was always difficult for him because he was still trying to adapt to it. But now for the last full year, he hasn't been gaining weight. So like we're now in like the realization, whatever you got, want to say, where he's not continuing to try to gain weight while running fast. And in this offseason, we were able to push his metrics where he was, finally approaching 22 miles an hour. he took a return to the house against West Virginia, but he never reached higher than 19 miles an hour because it was a ton of change in direction. He was actually, ran forward, got out of a tackle, stopped, started, changed direction, and then never had to actually run faster because everybody either missed the tackle, or by the time he was running away from them, he didn't have to keep running because it was not that far. Another example, we had a DB who is actually the fastest guy on the team. He's a routine above 22-mile-an-hour guy. He had a pick six, again, 100 yards, but it wasn't that scenario. It was like had to wrestle the ball from somebody, get away, and again, never reached higher than 19 miles an hour because it was about those game moments and stop, start. They were just able to get to those speeds faster than everybody else after that contact and after that collision. So it really does, like I said, it has completely changed me because of what you said. Everybody there was a massive shift, a paradigm shift of like, what's everybody's fly 10, right? Rather than like how much you bench. It was like, what's your fly 10? Oh, you're not doing fly 10s, you're a fucking loser, right? Like, so I was pushing the shit out of that with everybody. And then I was like, well, wait a minute, how can we keep, pushing the envelope with this as well? So that's again, something that I think our listeners out there will 100% gain knowledge from.
Yeah, I love that you said that because it just reminded me how last year we had a guy with an 80-yard punt return, and I don't think he got higher than 18 miles per hour at any point. And then with our DBs, you might see a guy hit over 21. And when you go back and watch the film, that was the play that he busted up his coverage and had to go chase that guy down. Right. So it's like, it's crazy.
Or you hope it was something like, again, I remember Higginbotham posted something where it was like, make sure you understand your context. Cause it was that same thing. He's like, if your DB is hitting 22, like you better hope it was kickoff, because otherwise it means he's getting burnt. Unless it's a situation like I had a linebacker, this kid, he won the genetic lottery. He's like 210 and he hit 22 miles an hour because he took a great angle to hawk a running back. Right. And, plays like that can be, point saving plays.
Right.
But you're right. Right. It's all about the game moments. And again, UCAM, not University, Indiana, max velo for linemen. You doing it or not? You brought it up.
Say that again.
Max velocity. You doing like, what do you know that the quality needs to be touched. So what are you doing? Again, this is your own brain, that nothing anybody else, but like, how do you feel about it? You mentioned it.
So now being my experience here, especially one from working with NFL offensive linemen, which was interestingly enough, probably the most clients at one position I had at DeFranco's in the NFL were offensive linemen.
But it makes sense because DeFranco's gym was like fucking lift weight.
Right.
Like, and that's.
Yeah, exactly. And so.
And lift it and smash it.
So talking with those guys, and if I had asked any of them to do a fly sprint, they would have quit and gone to a different gym. And so like most of them didn't even want to do like a box jump. I mean, like it was just, a lot of them got to that point. And what I learned too was that guards and centers in the NFL are different than tackles. Like tackles are more athletic. They're typically like longer dudes. They have, better feet, quote unquote, whatever that means. Like that's how people describe them. Right. But the tackles were interested more in some of that athletic stuff, where the guards are like, I just want to like bench heavy, squat. I want to do all this like meathead
because
stuff.
The tackles have the fucking other freaks DNs trying to pass rush
right.
around them.
But even those guys, like it would have been the same thing. They wouldn't want to do a fly sprint. But what I had done at the time was like at most like a 10-yard entry with a 10-yard burst, like, like a 20-yard total type of thing. And I think there's some value in that to touch on it if you want to just sort of get them in a situation where theoretically it could be they pull around and have to keep climbing all the way up to the safety or something like that. Do they have the ability to do that? Here, what we typically do mostly with them, and this is what I personally agree with too, is that if we want to touch something that's upright and more elastic, we do more extensive type of drills with those guys, like A skips for 30 plus yards, like 30 to 40 yards. Typically we keep those guys around 30, but like we'll do that with everybody, just to work some elastic endurance, where it's like running A's, A skips. It might be like little ankle bounds, things like that, where they're just being bouncy and springy for a certain distance that's a little bit prolonged, where they get a little burn through the calf and the ankle and all that in the foot. And we might do that as part of a warm-up circuit in our field before we get into some of our more true, high acceleration, deceleration type of work. But I think there's some value in those guys doing that to touch on some elastic qualities, just to have it available to them for when they need it. But my personal belief in terms of just like fly sprinting those dudes and all of that, I just don't see the value personally. I just don't think that it's something that is really worth spending a lot of time on with them unless they're training for the combine. You know, at that point, yeah, you got, because everybody's got to run a 40-yard dash. But if not, I mean, especially being in the Big Ten, and we're playing teams like Ohio State, Michigan, you know, Michigan State, Penn State, and we see their linemen up front. It's like, dude, we just need to get these guys like as big, as strong, and as powerful as we possibly can. So they just need to move that dude across from them. You know what I mean? It's very similar to like sumo wrestling in a way. Like, are you going to watch a sumo wrestler do a fly 30? I mean, it's just like, it would be like, the thought of it is ridiculous, right? And so for me, I see a lot of value in like, can I teach that guy to accelerate and have a certain speed around curves, you know, more like curved movements, sharp angle curves and things like that. Like if the guy's got to pull around, or if it's a DN, like bending around somebody, you know, certain DNs / outside linebackers will have to cover guys. So in those situations, I would say you could probably classify him more as like a big skill guy, where like, yeah, they probably should do some flying sprint work a little bit, because what if they got to cover the running back and that dude runs a wheel? Like they got to stay with him, you know?
Yeah,
So
like depending on your coverage, if you're, you know, even if you're playing like cover 4 and they're covering out into the flat and it's a vertical concept, like you just have to.
Exactly. So I think, again, that's where you think about, what does this guy need to do? But if we're thinking about like defensive tackles and offensive linemen, to me, it's just like to spend time on max velocity work with those guys is all time that's taken away from getting them to be just bigger and stronger and more powerful. And I think there's a ton of value in teaching those guys to be strong and fast and powerful against resistance in a horizontal direction. Like that's where I think I've seen it here, where we've done things where like we're squatting guys heavy and this dude squats the house. And then we go out on the field and we say, you're going to push this prowler or sled for 10 yards. You have a 3-second clock. And if you're able to reach that 10-yard area before 3 seconds, add weight, you know, like things like that. And so like some of these dudes that can squat the house vertically, as soon as they try to do something like that, they can't translate it. Like they're vertically very strong, but there's something about the horizontal direction that they struggle with. And then you get some guys that are, maybe they're a D tackle and they don't squat a ton, but they do really well with something like a clean or a loaded jump, where they're a little more explosive. And then you get them on the sled and you say, push this thing, you know, the same thing. You have 3-second clock, push this thing 10 yards. If you get there before 3 seconds, add weight. And then that dude's got like more weight than anybody on the sled. He's just pushing that thing, driving through. He's got a ton of power. So that's where I think with those guys, you know, it's like they're always working against resistance. So a lot of the time, that's probably how we should have them train. But at the same time, they got to be nimble. Like if they pull around the corner, they got to be quick around certain curves and sharp angles and things like that. So I think there's a lot of benefit to doing some change of direction type of work, or curvy linear running with those guys from that standpoint. But just the pure, I'm going to do a fly 20 or fly 10 and just this is going to sprint super fast. To me, it just doesn't make a lot of sense personally.
With that, again, I think I could have talked to you about this stuff all day long. I want to respect your time. So thank you very much for that. If you want to give any of our listeners out there that aren't familiar, like we said, you put out great content. Is there a place, you know, social media that you want them to follow you or to reach out if, you know, to just continue to follow any of the stuff that you're putting out?
Yeah, the only social media I have right now is Twitter. And on there, my Twitter handle name is @IU Coach Josse. The IU is for Indiana University. And that's really where I post any writing that I do or any other content that I contribute to. I put on that Twitter. We have the process books that I wrote with Fergus Connolly. Those are out. They're on Amazon and ultimateathleteconcepts.com. We basically wrote, that's one of them right there. We wrote 4 different books. The 4th one really just being templates and certain things that are laid out. The first 3 are actual books, and it's all Fergus's work really that I just helped funnel into a series of books and added a little bit of my personal opinion in there as well. But a lot of it is really credited to all the work that Fergus did. Tremendous body of work, I think, just in terms of giving food for thought on the team sport performance and organizational structure and all of these things that go into really helping a team win, not just getting a player bigger, faster, stronger, but really helping a team have a winning season. And other than that, I mean, most of the stuff's going to be posted on my Twitter. You know, I have some papers coming out. I started my PhD with JB Moran. So as we publish,
you are?
papers, yeah,
Congratulations,
so,
man.
Appreciate it. So
hey, if you got to ask some questions, man, I'm here to help. And I know DeMarco is in the same boat, right? I mean, you got somebody right there too, but shit, if you ever need to talk.
Absolutely. No, I'm sure I will. Cause, but you know, any papers we publish from that, I'll post on Twitter. And, you know, our staff here, we wrote a book together. Aaron Wellman's like the main editor on it. We all contributed. Pete Remis is on it because he was able to get grandfathered into that before he left us. And, so that'll come out probably in March next year, I think is the date that'll come out. It's
you allowed to tell us the title or tease it or what? No,
it's going to be a new edition of Complete Conditioning for Football by Human Kinetics. So that'll be out in March. I think the last one they put out was like 2013, had like Jeremy Macklin on the cover. So we've been working on that. Like the last 2 years we've been working on it. So it's going to be good when that thing comes out. It's a very basic book in terms of like overviewing the, you know, just strength conditioning in football, but you know, we put a lot of work into it. So we're proud of that too. And that's coming out, but yeah, anything that comes out, I'll put on my Twitter. So if anybody wants to,
and don't forget, he's on Fundamentals. So it's buy it. Cause his stuff, I mean, the stuff that you put out there for the sprint stuff is awesome too. So don't forget about that one.
That's right. Yep. Fundamentals course. Appreciate you bringing that up. I would have forgotten about that.
No, it's all good, man. Thank you for the time. Go enjoy the rest of your day. We really appreciate this. And I know everybody will get a ton out of it.
Appreciate it, Coach.
Congratulations on making it to the end of the video. Why don't you celebrate by watching more videos just like it? You can also help us on our quest to placate the algorithm gods by liking, sharing, subscribing, and commenting. Thank you.